Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit that is certain of itself, morality. Conscience, the beautiful soul, evil, and its forgiveness, continued. The self enters into existence as self. The self-assured spirit exists as such for others. Its immediate action is not that which has validity and is actual. What is acknowledged is not the determinate aspect of the action, not its intrinsic being, but solely the self-knowing self as such. The element of lasting being is the universal self-consciousness. What enters into this element cannot be the effect of the action. The effect cannot endure in it, and acquires no permanence. It is only self-consciousness that is acknowledged and that obtains an actual existence. Here again, then, we see language as the existence of spirit. Language is self-consciousness existing for others. Self-consciousness, which as such is immediately present, and this self-consciousness is universal. It is the self that separates itself from itself, which as pure I equals I, becomes objective to itself, which in this objectivity equally preserves itself as this self, just as it coalesces directly with other selves and is this self-consciousness. It perceives itself just as it is perceived by others, and the perceiving is just existence, which has become a self. The content which language has here acquired is no longer the perverted and perverting and distracted, a self of the world of culture. On the contrary, it is the spirit that has returned into itself, is certain of itself, and certain in itself of its truth, or of its own recognition of that truth, and which is acknowledged as knowing it. The language of the ethical spirit is law, and simple command and complaint, which is more the shedding of a tear about necessity. Moral consciousness, on the other hand, is still dumb, shut up with itself within its inner life, for there the self does not as yet have an existence. Existence and the self stand as yet only in an external relation to each other. Language, however, only emerges in the middle as the middle term, mediating between independent and acknowledged self-consciousness. And the existent self is immediately universal acknowledgement, an acknowledgement on the part of many, and in this manifoldness, a simple acknowledgement. The content of the language of conscience is the self that knows itself as essential being. This alone is what it declares, and this declaration is the true actuality of the act, and the validating of the action. Consciousness declares its conviction. It is in this conviction alone that the action is a duty. Also, it is valid as duty, solely through the conviction of being declared. For universal self-consciousness is free from the specification that merely is. What is valid for that self-consciousness is not the action as an existence, but the conviction that it is a duty. And this is made actual in language. To make the deed a reality does not mean here translating its content from the form of purpose or being for self into the form of an abstract reality. It means translating it from the form of immediate self-certainty, which knows its knowledge or being for self to be essential being, into the form of an assurance that consciousness is convinced of its duty, and as conscience knows in its own mind what duty is. This assurance thus affirms that consciousness is convinced that its conviction is the essence of the matter. Whether the assurance of acting from a conviction of duty is true, whether what is done is actually a duty, these questions or doubts have no meaning when addressed to conscience. To ask whether the assurance is true would presuppose that the inner intention is different from the one put forward, that is, that what the individual self wills can be separated from duty, from the will of the universal and pure consciousness. The latter would be put into words, but the former would be strictly the true motive of the action. But this distinction between the universal consciousness and the individual self is just what has been superseded, and the supersession of it is conscience. The self's immediate knowing that it is certain of itself in law is law and duty. Its intention to being its own intention is what is right. All that is required is that it should know this, and should state its conviction that its knowing and willing are right. The declaration of this assurance in itself rids the form of its particularity. It thereby acknowledges the necessary universality of the self in calling itself conscience. It calls itself pure knowledge of self and pure abstract willing. That is, it calls itself a universal knowing and willing which recognizes and acknowledges others. It is the same as them, for they are just this pure self-knowing and willing, and which for that reason is also recognized and acknowledged by them. In the will of the self that is certain of itself, in this knowledge that the self is essential being, lies the essence of what is right. Therefore, whoever says he acts in such a way from conscience speaks the truth, for his conscience is the self that knows and wills, but it is essential that he should say so, for this self must be at the same time the universal self. It is not universal in the content of the act, for this, on account of its specificity, is intrinsically an indifferent affair. It is in the form of the act that the universality lies. It is in this form which is to be established as actual. It is the self which as such is actual in language, which declares itself to be the truth, and just by so doing, acknowledges all the other selves and is acknowledged by them. Conscience then is the majesty of its elevation. In the majesty of its elevation above specific law and every content of duty, puts whatever content it pleases into its knowing and willing. It is the moral genius which knows the inner voice of what it immediately knows to be a divine voice. And since in knowing this it has an equally immediate knowledge of existence, it is the divine, a creative power which in its notion possesses the spontaneity of life. Equally, it is in its own self divine worship, for its action is the contemplation of its own divinity. Some nice French ladies there playing backgammon. I wouldn't mind joining. I've got a headache. Anyway, to continue. This solitary divine worship is at the same time essentially the divine worship of a community, and the pure inner knowing and perceiving of itself advances to the moment of consciousness. The contemplation of itself is its objective existence, and this objective element is the declaration of its knowing and willing as something universal. Through this declaration, the self acquires moral validity, and the act becomes an effective deed. The actuality and lasting existence of what it does is universal self-consciousness, but the declaration of conscience affirms the certainty of itself to be pure self, and thereby to be a universal self. On account of this utterance, in which the self is expressed and acknowledged as essential being, the validity of the act is acknowledged by others. The spirit and substance of their association are thus the mutual assurance of their conscientiousness, good intentions, the rejoicing over this mutual purity, and the refreshing of themselves in the glory of knowing and uttering, of cherishing and fostering such an excellent state of affairs. Insofar as this conscience still distinguishes its abstract consciousness from its self-consciousness, it has only a hidden life in God. It is true that God is immediately present in its mind and heart in itself, but what is manifest is its actual consciousness, and the mediating movement of that consciousness is for it something other than that hidden inner life and the immediacy of God's presence. It's only the completed form of conscience that the distinction between its abstract consciousness and its self-consciousness is eliminated. Conscience knows that the abstract consciousness is just this self, this being for self, that it's certain of itself, knows that it is precisely in the immediacy of the relation of the self to the inner self, which when posited outside the self is an abstract God and hidden from it, that the difference is eliminated. For that relation is a mediating one, in which the related terms are not one and the same, but each is another. For the other and only in a third term are they one. The immediate relation, however, means in fact nothing else but the unity of the terms, the consciousness that has risen above the thoughtlessness that still holds these differences, which are not to be differences, knows the immediacy of the presence within it of the absolute being as the unity of that being and its own self. And it thus knows itself as the living in itself, and knows that this knowledge is religion, which as knowledge that has a perceived or outer existence is the utterance of the community concerning its own spirit. Here then we see self-consciousness withdraws into its innermost being, for which all externality as such has vanished, withdrawn into the contemplation of the I equals I, in which this I is the whole of essentiality and existence. It is submerged in this notion of itself, for it has been driven to the limit of its extremes, and moreover, in such a way that the moments distinguished whereby it is real, or is still consciousness, are not only for us these pure extremes. On the contrary, what it is for itself, and what it is for it intrinsic, and what is for its existence, have evaporated into abstractions which no longer have any stability, any substance, for this consciousness itself, and all that before was essential being for consciousness, has reverted into these abstractions. Refined into this purity, consciousness exists in its purest form, and the poverty which constitutes its sole possession is itself a vanishing. This absolute certainty into which substance has resolved itself is the absolute untruth which collapses internally. It is the absolute self-consciousness in which consciousness is submerged. Looking at this submergence of consciousness within itself, we see that the unexplicated substance for consciousness, knowledge as its knowledge, as consciousness, it is divided into the antithesis of itself and its object, which is for it essence. But it is just this object that is perfectly transparent, is its own self, and its consciousness, that should say. Its consciousness is only this knowledge of itself. All life, all spiritual essentiality has withdrawn into this self and has lost its difference from the I itself. The moments of consciousness are therefore these extreme abstractions, none of which endures, but each of which loses itself in the other and produces it. It is the fluctuating attitude to itself of the unhappy consciousness, but here this fluctuation takes place explicitly for consciousness within itself, and it's conscious of being the notion of reason, whereas the unhappy consciousness is only implicitly that notion. The absolute certainty of itself thus finds itself qua consciousness changed immediately into a sound that dies away, into an objectification of its being for self, but this created world is its speech, which likewise it has immediately heard, and only the echo of which returns to it. This return therefore does not mean that the self is in essence and actuality present in its speech, for essence is not for it and in it, it's not for it and in itself, or merely implicit being, but its very self. Just as little has consciousness and outer existence, for the objective aspect does not get as far as being a negative of the actual self, in the same way that the self does not attain to an actual existence. It lacks the power to externalize itself, the power to make itself into a thing, and to endure mere being. It lives in dread of besmirching the splendor of its inner being by action and an existence, and in order to preserve the purity of its heart, it flees from contact with the actual world and persists in its self-willed impotence. To renounce itself, which is reduced to the extreme of ultimate abstraction, and to give itself a substantial existence, or to transform its thought into being and put its trust in the absolute difference between thought and being. The hollow object which it has produced for itself now fills it, therefore, with a sense of emptiness. Its activity is a yearning which merely loses itself as consciousness becomes an object devoid of substance, and rising above this loss and falling back on itself, finds itself only as a lost soul in this transparent purity of its moments. An unhappy so-called beautiful soul, its light dies away within it, and it vanishes like a shapeless vapour that dissolves into thin air. This silent fusion of the pithless essentialities of the evaporated life has, however, still to be taken in the other meaning of the actuality of conscience and in the manifestation of its movement. Conscience has to be considered as acting. The objective moment in this consciousness, acquired above the determination of a universal consciousness, the knowledge that knows itself is qua the particular self, distinct from the other selves, the language in which all reciprocally acknowledge each other as acting conscientiously. This universal identity falls apart into the non-identity of individual being for self. Each consciousness is just as much simply reflected out of its universality into itself. As a result, the antithesis of individuality to other individuals and to the universal inevitably comes on the scene, and we have to consider the relationship and its movement. In other words, this universality and the duty have the very opposite significance of the specific individuality that exempts itself from the universal, for which pure duty is only a universality that appears on the surface and is turned outwards. Duty is only a matter of words and counts as a being for another. Conscience, which in the first instance is only negatively directed against duty, as is given specific duty, knows itself to be free from it. But since it fills the empty duty with a specific content from itself, it is positively aware that it as this particular self, makes the content. Its pure self as an empty knowing is something devoid of content and determination. The content which it gives to that knowing is taken from its own self, as this specific self is taken from itself as a natural individuality. And in speaking of the consciousness of its action, it may well be aware of its pure self, but in the purpose of its action, a purpose with an actual content, it is aware of itself as this particular individual and is conscious of the antithesis between what it is for itself and what it is for others, of the antithesis of universality of duty and its reflection out of universality into itself. More French ladies. Lucky man. While in this way the antithesis into which conscience enters when it acts expresses itself in its inner being, the antithesis is at the same time a disparity on its outer side in the element of existence. The disparity of its particular individuality is in relation to another individual. Its particularity consists in the fact that the two moments constituting its consciousness, the self and the inner self, are held to be unequal in value within it, a disparity in which they are so determined that the certainty of itself is the essential being in face of the in itself, or the universal, which counts only as a moment. In contrast to this internal determination, there thus stands the element of existence, or universal consciousness, for which the essential being is rather universality, a duty, while individual, on the other hand, which is in contrast to the universal, is for itself, counts only as a superseded moment. For the consciousness, which holds firmly to duty, the first consciousness counts as evil, because of the disparity between its inner being and the universal, and since at the same time this first consciousness declares its action to be in conformity with itself, to be duty and conscientiousness, it is held by the universal consciousness to be hypocrisy. The movement of this antithesis is in the first instance the formal production of an identity of what evil consciousness is in its own self, and what it declares itself to be. It must be made apparent that it is evil, and thus its existence made to correspond to its essence. The hypocrisy must be unmasked. This return of the disparity present in hypocrisy into a correspondence is not already an accomplished fact, because hypocrisy, as it is commonly said, demonstrates its respect for duty and virtue, justly makes a show of them, and using them as a mask to hide itself from its own consciousness, and no less than from others. As if in this acknowledgement of the antithesis within itself, identity and correspondence were implied, only it is at the same time just as much reflected out of this spoken acknowledgement and into itself. And the fact that it uses what is an essence as a being for another implies rather its own contempt for that essence and the exposure to everyone of its own lack of any substantial being, for what lets itself be used as an external instrument shows itself to be a thing which possesses no importance of its own. Also, this identity is not brought about either by the one-sided persistence of the evil consciousness in its own attitude, or by the judgment of the universal consciousness. If the former denies itself in face of the consciousness of duty and declares that what this asserts to be wickedness, to be absolutely non-identical with universal, is an action in accordance with inner law and conscience, then in this one-sided assurance of an identity there still remain its non-identity with the other, since this other does not believe it or acknowledge it. In other words, since the one-sided persistence is in one extreme cancels itself out, evil would. It is true thereby confess. It is true thereby confess. No, there shouldn't be the punctuation is wrong. Just a moment. Evil would, it is true, thereby confess to being evil, but in so doing it would directly abolish itself and cease to be hypocrisy, and would not as such unmask itself. It admits in fact to being evil by asserting that it acts in opposition to the acknowledged universal, according to its own inner law and conscience. For if this law and conscience were not the law of its single individuality and caprice, it would not be something inner or peculiar to it, but what is universally acknowledged. Therefore, when anyone says that he is acting according to his own law and conscience against others, he is saying, in fact, that he is wronging them. But actual conscience is not this persistence in a knowing and willing that opposes itself to the universal. On the contrary, the universal is the element of its existence, and its language declares its action to be an acknowledged duty. Just as little is the persistence of the universal consciousness in its judgment and unmasking and absolute abolition of hypocrisy. In denouncing hypocrisy as base, vile, and so on, it is appealing in such judgment to its own law. Just as the evil consciousness appeals to its law, for the former comes forward in opposition to the latter, and thereby as a particular law. It has therefore no superiority over the other law, rather it legitimizes it, and this zeal does the very opposite of what it means to do, for it shows that what it calls true or genuine duty, and which ought to be universally acknowledged, is something not acknowledged. In so doing, it concedes to the other an equal right to before itself. It concedes to the other an equal right to before itself. This judgment has, however, at the same time, another aspect from which it becomes the way to a resolution of the antithesis confronting it. The consciousness of the universal in its relation to the first, evil consciousness, does not behave as one that is actual and acts, for the latter is rather the actual consciousness, but in its antithesis to it is a consciousness that is not entangled in the antithesis of individuality and universality, which occurs when action is entered upon. It remains in the universality of thought, behaves as a consciousness, and apprehends, and its first action is merely one of judgment. Now through the judgment it places itself, as we have just remarked, alongside the first consciousness, and the latter through this, like this, comes to see its own self in this other consciousness. And for the consciousness of duty maintains an attitude of passive sense apprehension, but it is thereby in contradiction with itself as the absolute will of duty as a consciousness whose determining comes solely from itself. It does well to preserve itself in its purity, for it does not act. It is the hypocrisy which wants its judging to be taken for an actual deed, and instead of proving its rectitude by actions, does so by uttering fine sentiments. Its nature then is altogether the same as that which is reproached with making duty a mere matter of words. In both alike, the side of reality is distinct from the words uttered in the one through the selfish purpose of the action, in the other through the failure to act at all, although the necessity to act is involved in the very talk of duty, for duty without deeds is utterly meaningless. Judging, however, is also to be looked at as a positive act of thought and has a positive content. Through this aspect, the contradiction present in the apprehending consciousness and its identity with the first consciousness becomes still more complete. The consciousness that acts declares its specific action to be a duty, and the consciousness that judges it cannot deny this. For duty itself is the form which lacks all content, but is capable of any. In other words, the concrete action which in its many-sidedness is its own form, is its own self-diverse, contains the universal aspect, that which is taken as a duty, just as much as the particular aspect which constitutes the share and interest of the individual in the action. Now, the judging consciousness does not stop short at the former aspect of duty, at the doer's knowledge of it, that this is his duty, and at the fact that the doer knows it to be his duty, the condition and status of his reality. On the contrary, it holds to the other aspect, looks at what the action is in itself, and explains it as resulting from an intention different from the action itself and from selfish motives. Just as every action is capable of being looked at from the point of view of conformity to duty, so too can it be considered from the point of view of the particularity of the doer, for qua action it is the actuality of the individual. This judging of the action thus takes it out of its outer existence and reflects it into its inner aspect or into the form of its own particularity. The three graces. Would they would grace me? Well, I'm wearing my nighttime t-shirt. If the action is accompanied by fame, then it knows this inner aspect to be a desire for fame. If it is altogether in keeping with the station of the individual without going beyond this station, and as such a nature that the individuality does not possess its station as a character externally attached to it, but through its own self, it gives filling to this universality, thereby showing itself capable of a higher station. Then the inner aspect of the action is judged to be ambition, and so on. Since in the action as such the doer attains to a vision of himself in objectivity, or to a feeling of self in his existence, and thus to enjoyment, the inner aspect is judged to be an urge to secure his own happiness, even though this were to consist merely in an inner moral conceit, in the enjoyment of being conscious of his own superiority, and in the foretaste of a hope of future happiness. No action can escape such judgment, for duty's sake, this pure purpose is an unreality. It becomes a reality in the deed of an individuality, and the action is thereby charged with the aspect of particularity. No man is a hero to his valet, whose dealings are with the man not as a hero, but as one who eats, drinks, and wears clothes, in general, with his individual wants and fancies. Thus, for the judging consciousness, there is no action in which it could not oppose to the universal aspect of the action, the personal aspect of the individuality, and play the part of the moral valet toward the agent. The consciousness that judges in this way is itself base, because it divides up the action, producing and holding fast to the disparity of the action with itself. Further, it is hypocrisy because it passes off such judging and as another manner of being wicked, but as the correct consciousness of the action, setting itself up in this unreality and conceit of knowing well and better above the deeds it discredits, and wanting its words without deeds to be taken for a superior kind of reality. By putting itself then in this way on a level with the doer, on whom it passes judgment, it is recognized by the latter as the same as himself. This latter does not merely find himself apprehended by the other as something alien and disparate from it, but rather finds that the other, according to its own nature and disposition, identical with himself, perceiving this identity and giving utterance to it, he confesses to this to the other, and equally expects that the other, having in fact put himself on the same level, will also respond in words in which he will give utterance to his identity with him, and expects that this mutual recognition will now exist in fact. His confession is not an abasement, a humiliation, a throwing away of himself in relation to the other, for this utterance is not a one-sided affair which would establish his disparity with the other. On the contrary, he gives himself utterance solely on account of his having seen his identity with the other. He, on his side, gives expression to their common identity in his confession and gives utterance to it for the reason that language is the existence of spirit as an immediate self. He thereby expects that the other will contribute his part to this existence. But the confession of the one who is wicked, I am so, is not followed by a reciprocal similar confession. This was not what the judging consciousness meant. Quite the contrary. It repels this community of nature and is the hard heart that is for itself and which rejects any continuity with the other. As a result, the situation is reversed. The one who made the confession sees himself repulsed and sees the other to be in the wrong when he refuses to let his own inner being come forth into the outer existence of speech. When the other contrasts the beauty of his own soul with the penitent's wickedness, yet confronts the confession of the penitent with his own stiff-necked, unrepentant character, mutely keeping himself to himself and refusing to throw himself away for someone else, there is here expressed in its extreme form the rebellion of the spirit that is certain of itself, for it beholds itself as the simple self-knowledge in someone else, and too in such a way that even the outer shape of this other is not, as in the case of material wealth, something without substantial being, is not a thing. On the contrary, what is held opposed to this other is thought, simply knowledge itself, this absolutely fluid continuity of pure knowing, which refuses to put itself into communication with the other, which in its confession had ipso facto renounced its separate being for self, and thereby expressly superseded its particularity, and in so doing posited itself in continuity with the other as universal. The other, however, retains within itself and for itself its uncommunicative being for itself, and it retains in face of the individual who did confess just the same uncommunicative being for self, although the latter has already thrown this away. It thereby reveals itself as a consciousness, which is forsaken by and which itself denies spirit. For it does not know that spirit, in the absolute content of itself, is lord and master over every deed and actuality, and can cast them off, and make them as if they had never happened. At the same time, it does not recognize the contradiction of it falls into in not letting the rejection which has taken place in words be validated in a genuine rejection, while itself has the certainty of its spirit, not in an actual deed, but in its inner being, and finds the outer existence of this inner being in the utterance of its judgment. It is this its own self which hinders that others return from the deed into the spiritual existence of speech and into the identity of spirit, and by this hardness of heart produces the disparity which still exists. Now, insofar as the self-certain spirit, as a beautiful soul, does not possess the power to renounce the knowledge of itself which it keeps to itself, it cannot attain to an identity with the consciousness it has repulsed, nor therefore to a vision of the unity of itself in the other, and cannot attain to an objective existence. Consequently, the identity comes about only negatively. As a being devoid of spirit, the beautiful soul lacking an actual existence, entangled in the contradiction between its pure self and the necessity of that self to externalize itself and change itself into an actual existence, and dwelling in the immediacy of this firmly held antithesis, an immediacy which alone is the middle term, reconciling the antithesis, which has been identified and intensified to its pure abstraction and its pure being or empty nothingness. This beautiful soul, then, being conscious of this contradiction in its unreconciled immediacy, is disordered to the point of madness, wastes itself in yearning, and pines away in consumption. Thereby it does in fact surrender the being for self, in which it so stubbornly clings, but what it brings forth is only the non-spiritual unity of mere being. That's his aunt, by the way. Well, why not? Keep it in the family. We know what he's thinking. Well, I'm talking about conscience. The true, that is, the self-conscious and existent equalization of the two sides is necessitated by and already contained in the foregoing. The breaking of the hard heart and the raising of it to universality is the same movement which was expressed in the consciousness that made confession of itself. The wounds of the spirit heal and leave no scars behind. The deed is not imperishable, it is taken back by spirit into itself, and the aspect of individuality present in it, whether as intention or as an existent negativity and limitation, straightway vanishes. The self that carries out the action, the forms of its act, is only the moment of the whole, and so likewise is the knowledge that by its judgment determines and establishes the distinction between the individual and universal aspects of the action. The evil consciousness, referred to above, posits the externalization of itself, or posits itself as a moment, being enticed into openly confessing itself by the vision of itself in the other. But just as the former has to surrender its one-sided, unacknowledged existence of its particular being for self, so too must this other set aside its one-sided, unacknowledged judgment, and just as the former exhibits the power of spirit over its actual existence, so does this other exhibit the power of spirit over the specific notion of itself. The latter, however, renounces the divisive thought and the hard-heartedness of the being for self, which clings to it, because it has in fact seen itself in the first. The first consciousness, which turns its back on its actual existence and makes itself into a superseded particular consciousness, thereby displays itself as in fact a universal. It returns from its external actual existence back into itself as essential being, and therein the universal consciousness does recognize itself. The forgiveness which it extends to the other is the renunciation of itself, of its unrealized essential being, which it put on a level with that other, which was a real action, and acknowledges that with what thought characterized as bad, namely action is good, or rather it abandons the distinction of the specific thought and its subjectively determined judgment, just as the outer abandons the subjective characterization of action. The word of reconciliation is the objectively existent spirit, which beholds the pure knowledge of itself qua universal essence in its opposite, in the pure knowledge of itself qua absolutely self-contained and exclusive individuality, a reciprocal recognition which is absolute spirit. It enters into existence only at that point where its pure knowledge about itself is the antithesis and alternation of its dual aspect. Aware that its pure knowledge is an abstract essence, absolute spirit is this conscious duty, which, in absolute antithesis to the knowledge that is conscious of itself, qua absolute individuality of self as essence. The former is the pure continuity of the universal, which is aware that the individuality which is conscious of itself as essence is intrinsically a nullity, is evil. This, however, is the absolute discreteness which is conscious of itself in the pure oneness of as absolute, and of the universal as something unreal, which exists only for someone else. Both aspects are purified into a unity in which there is no longer in them any existence devoid of itself, any negative of consciousness, where, on the contrary, a duty is the unchanging identical character of itself. Knowledge and evil equally has its purpose in its being within itself and its actuality in its utterance. The content of this utterance is the substance of its enduring existence. It is the assurance of spirit's immanent self-certainty. Each of these two self-certain spirits has no other purpose than its own pure self, and no other reality and existence than just this pure self. But yet they are different, and the difference is absolute because it is set in this element of the pure notion. It is also absolute not only for us, but for the notion themselves, which stand in this antithesis. For these notions, though specific in relation to one another, are at the same time in themselves universal, so that they fill out the whole range of the self, and this self has no other content than this its own determinateness, which neither goes beyond the self nor is more restricted than it. One of them, the absolute universal, is equally the pure knowledge of itself, as the other is the absolute discreteness of individuality, and both are only this pure self-knowledge. Both determinatenesses are thus pure conscious notions, whose determinateness is itself immediately a knowing, or whose relationship and antithesis is the I. Consequently, they are these sheer opposites for one another. It is the completely inner being which thus confronts its own self and enters into outer existence. They constitute pure knowledge, which through this antithesis is posited as consciousness, but it is still not yet self-consciousness. It becomes actually such in the movement of this antithesis, for the antithesis is rather itself the indiscrete continuity and identity of I equals I, and each through the very contradiction of its pure universality, which at the same time is still strive against its identity with the other, and cuts itself off from it, explicitly supersedes itself within its own self. Through this externalization, this knowledge, which in its existence is self-discordant, returns into the unity of the self. It is the actual I, the universal knowledge of itself in its absolute opposite, in the knowledge which remains internal, and which, on account of the purity of its separated being within self, is itself completely universal. The reconciling yea, in which the two I's let go their antithetical existence, is the existence of the I, which has expanded into a duality, and therein remains identical with itself, and in its complete externalization and opposite possesses the certainty of itself. It is God manifested in the midst of those who know themselves in the form of pure knowledge. Form indeed. I do rather like beautiful form, I must admit. Anyway, this is the end of the spirit section. What is next is religion.